Thank you very much. Can I ask the CDI? It seems to me that it is very much in the interests of the Iraqi people that UNSCOM's work is brought to as speedy a conclusion as is possible. Does he believe that UNSCOM is still able to do its work as effectively since the signing of the agreement with Saddam Hussein and the recent agreement? Or does he believe that its organisation is in fact now compromised in what it is able to do because of the added obligation that's been added to it?
Probably more appropriately addressed to ministers than to me, but I would think it is probably our assessment that the GCC states are not alone in present circumstances. As the CDI said, it's more his field than mine, capable of resisting the threat from both Iraq and Iran, and that of course is why there are Western military assets in the Gulf. I don't think the Strategic Defence Review envisages any dramatic steps of a negative kind in respect of that presence, but I'm not going to get deeply into that. But I think the commitment of the British government and indeed the US government to Gulf security is clear. In relation to Iran, yes, we and the GCC are engaged in dialogue with Iran, and I think that's useful and important, and it obviously helps to improve the climate and maybe reflects a reduction in the sense of threat. But there is clearly the potential there still for problems, and as George pointed out, there are specific difficulties, like the difficulties over the Tunis Islands. So I don't think you can say that that threat has disappeared. Maybe under the new dispensation it's less immediate. I mean, I'm sure that dialogue helps. I'm not sure that structured quadripartite dialogue is where we've quite got yet, but I think it is helpful and useful. I think we should sort of continue to exchange views as between the EU and GCC with the US as well on how it's moving.
Could I just say a little bit on the SDR side? I mean, I think as Minister of Armed Forces said yesterday, although of course we haven't declared what actually resulted in, so I've got to be a little careful. Yeah. But I think all the indications are that what we're going for in military terms are much more flexible, very rapidly responsive, expeditionary type forces. I mean, expedition is a bit of but can go and react to things very rapidly, and I think anything that comes out of the SDR will help rather than hinder what we've historically done in the Gulf region anyway. And that's all I'd add on the SDR side.
Well, there are a lot of facts coming through recent days, and future days, I don't know. In the recent crisis last February, there were conflicting views between the GCC countries and the United States and to a certain extent with the Britain on feasibility and reliability of the what we call forces to support diplomacy. Do you believe those are taken into the consideration in your review in the future, should a similar crisis might break out with Iraq?
I think that we are very sensitive to Gulf views, and I mean, that was demonstrated really by the very intensive activity, and the Foreign Secretary was there, Defence Secretary was there, Defence Ministers, to take the temperature of our Gulf partners during the crisis. So I think that is a key factor. I think that we will see. I mean, it seems to me quite likely that a new crisis could develop, although at the present moment Iraq is clearly, in respect of inspections, on its best behaviour, although it's not delivering, as the CDI said, in terms of the information that is necessary for the UN actually to declare Iraq in compliance. And that's the problem, really. We now have, at least possibly temporarily, a reasonably effective string of inspections actually in their simple conduct, but the information isn't being provided. I think there is a sense, really, that we don't need to let Saddam Hussein set the agenda. He shouldn't program the next crisis. I describe the various elements in containment that are there, including sanctions, a military force and the threat of military force is one of those. And it's clearly the case that neither the United Kingdom nor the United States is going to renounce it. But we would want to look at the circumstances and the nature of the threat.
Dr. Reid.
Thank you. It might help, I think ministers can always give short answers. You asked a number of questions, Your Excellency. One, do we still regard the Gulf as an important part of our security equation after the SDR? Yes. Will we still have the capability to assist militarily in the Gulf? Yes. Have we envisaged some permanent presence in the Gulf? Well, we've had very nearly a permanent presence there with the Miller Patrol for the last few years, and we don't envisage at this stage any change in that. And do we recognise and are we willing to work to overcome the difficulties of persuading all our European allies of the importance of the Gulf and using the full range of measures to resolve the area there? And I think the answer to that is yes as well. Of course, the level and the extent of the numbers of Europeans who would be prepared to be involved on any occasion will depend on the particular circumstances of the time, and it may vary between 1990 and 1997, 98. But I think there is an awareness of the importance of the area, and I also think that there was a much wider political support a few months ago than was sometimes reflected in the press, and there was also, in some ways, a much wider contribution in small units militarily than was sometimes reflected in reports as well.
Very good. My question really was for Alan West, just if you would be good enough to say a little more about the 3-kilo submarines. There was always some question as to whether or not the Iranian Navy could handle it and become operational. Would you be prepared to take your 20 ships in once they were?
Yes, just looking at these 3 kilos, I mean, it's always difficult for a country that's never had a submarine force to build it up and operate it effectively. And initially, there's no doubt the Iranians had problems. They had problems with batteries and things like that. Those problems have now been resolved, and we've recently seen all 3 operating. There is a difference between very advanced submarine operations. I describe that probably as submarines against submarines. And then the next level down, submarines fight against surface warships that have got an ASW capability with helicopters. The next level down, which is a submarine shooting at a merchant ship. I have no doubt at all that with these types of torpedoes the Iranians have got and the level of expertise they are rapidly coming up to, they present a very, very potent threat to merchant ships going through that region. Very potent threat. The way to sink a ship is knock a hole in its bottom, and they can do that very effectively. Would I like to put my ships and units there? Our Navy is particularly highly trained in anti-submarine warfare operations, and I think I could sink 3 Iranian kilos if I went there. If I was sure I could do that when I took my battle group there. But it is a complex thing to do, and it is very difficult to kill conventional submarines in shallow water and water of those varying temperature gradients. But they are a very serious threat to merchant shipping. You would be a very foolhardy ship owner, I believe, sending a supertanker through an area which had even 1 kilo with wake-homing torpedoes that could work. And you don't have to be that good a submariner. You have to have the basics to be able to sink a supertanker.
Thank you, gentlemen. I think our problem is much heavier than 3 kilos for the Navy. We are an Air Force and we think in tons. This morning, this briefing was very interesting to hear our European colleagues talk about the threat in the Gulf. However, we thought we might hear a little bit more than just Iraq and Iran. Today, with the different technologies and different interests of different parties, I think we should open the circle to further than Iraq and Iran. What we heard today is what's called review. It's very much, I wouldn't say nothing new in it, but we're hoping to see more meaty assessment of the threat, i.e. the occupation of the the island in Yemen, closing the Red Sea, i.e. the heavy armament programs in India, i.e. the Afghani-Irani problems. It's all affecting our area. We'll have to hear something about it.
Well, I think you raise a number of issues there, and yes, they are areas that one has to look at very carefully. I mean, for example, the India-Pakistan is an area where there is a certain rivalry, and I think I wouldn't see that as a direct threat, I have to say, personally, to the GCC states. I mean, it is a threat to world peace, and in that sense, anything like that can be seen as a threat if it develops and escalates. And there are other areas in the world where if things develop and escalate, it has the same impact. I think really we have to restrict what we were talking about. I mean, we haven't talked that much about what I call world terrorism, organised crime and this linkage with drugs, things like that, which are global issues, which are beginning to have an impact in certain areas of the world, not so much so in your region, but something that people are beginning to have to look at. I think I'd be rather wary of diving down into all these other regions. Maybe on a one-to-one we can talk in detail about a number of these issues if you're very interested.
The only one that I would have thought of talking about actually is the Afghan problem, which I think is a continuing source of instability, impinging on your region and impinging on ours too, because of what the Admiral already mentioned in respect to the drugs problem. This is a very real problem for Europe, and I believe it's a problem in other ways, the export of terrorism as well, in respect of the Middle East region. But I'm interested if you raise, I agree with what the Admiral said about India and Pakistan, I'm interested if you raise Yemen, Saudi Arabia. I think that actually George did mention that as one of the incipient problems, but I think it's a question of attitude and whether you actually perceive an immediate threat there.
I wouldn't be Yemen as such, but the occupation of area of Yemeni island closing the Red Sea.
I see, okay.
I mean, the world is much closer.
Yeah, if I could just make one comment on that. I mean, you're referring to the Hanesh Island dispute, I take it, yes. Well, I should point out that is actually under international mediation at the moment. And I'm not certain that you should assume that it has geopolitical implications of the kind of suggested, given the nature of the participants involved. It has a much more local consideration. And changes in Yemen would lead me to consider that that would not be an objective of the Yemeni government anyway.
Yes, I mean, it is an area we look at closely, particularly because of the traffic flow through there. It is under mediation. I was speaking with Alindienne last year when I had my battle group out there about the issue, because the French keep an eye on that for the international community. And I think my successor in Forbes there has talked with Alindienne about that particular issue. And I think I would agree with George on that in terms of its full ramifications.
Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed.
Yes, sir. My question is about Iran and about Khatami. How you see Khatami and how you evaluate him, and because what we have been reading and hearing that he is on the right side, and especially in the eyes of the European especially. How you see Khatami? Is he in the way we read about him, we hear about him, or he is with the same old group? Thank you.
I think we judge that his aspirations are to meet what seems to be the demands of the Iranian public for a more liberal regime which delivers internally in terms of prosperity, a slightly freer style of life, and that leads in his foreign policy concerns to a desire to open up to, as we've seen, the Gulf countries, to Europe, and if he could manage it on certain terms, possibly the United States as well. But the way in which his initial opening to the American people was then followed by statements by others and by himself suggests the other forces that are at work. And I think we also have questions in our minds about his control over all the levers within the political system and the bureaucracy, including some of the crucial ones, like the intelligence service and those agencies which are responsible for the development of weapons of mass destruction, which has been mentioned previously as a particular concern in respect of Iran. So I think what we see is an interesting and important development and aspirations on the part of Khatami as I described them. But the question mark, I think, remains over his ability to deliver, and there have been interesting signs that the battle over the mayorship in Tehran and so on, the way the debate may go. But it's not by any means over yet, and that I think all argues for a certain degree of caution in dealings.
The one question of overriding concern to all was the effect of any aftermath of a strike on the region, particularly in terms of retaliation and any instability that a vacuum where Iraq was might lead.
There was concern about the possibility of uprisings in southern Iraq, about the impact a heavy military attack might have on the integrity of Iraq. I certainly heard those concerns. I think that we thought that we would be able to launch a blow which would have a real impact and would cause serious damage. I don't think we anticipated or judged that it was likely to lead to the implosion of Iraq, which is what people, I think, were concerned about, the emphasis you hear on the territorial integrity of Iraq as a constant theme.
I mean, obviously, I can't talk here about sort of targeting and all that sort of things. All I would say was it became clear to Saddam Hussein, because initially he felt a few pinprick attacks might actually help him in the game he was playing, in terms of the way the international community would look at him, particularly countries in that region would look at his country. He became aware that the attack was going to be something more considerable than that he expected, and it would have been. All I would say in terms of targeting is the immense effort that goes in on our behalf to make sure that we don't hit innocent people and collateral is kept right down. There's always a risk as soon as you start fighting something will happen, of course, but the effort we put into it is immense. And what is very interesting, we have hard intelligence from inside Iraq that the Iraqi people, although they don't say that on television, and for very good reasons, are aware that we are very careful with our bombing. We have hard intelligence of that, which was an interesting thing I wasn't aware of before I came to this job. And I think the other thing I would say is that there's no doubt that the sort of attack that we would have carried out would have destabilised his position. And I think that's all I can say.
Thank you very much, Alan. I hope Brigadier Hamad Latia will forgive us for running over. We do have further time at the end of today for discussion. I mean, these are such critical issues, in a way the core of the conference, but I've been hesitant to cut it short. I wonder if I could just, in a couple of sentences, highlight points that came out which struck me as particularly important. First of all, in Derek Plumley's presentation, his emphasis on the need for regional political arrangements, on the traditional Shura approach, and that it was for Gulf governments to decide the pace of change. I think that's an important comment from the Director of the Middle East in the Foreign Office. Secondly, from Admiral Alan West, his conclusion that Iraq and Iran are committed to retaining a strong armed forces capability as a high priority with the aim of regional leadership. George Joffe covered issues which have potential social impact, viewing those issues very much through Western eyes, and it would be interesting to hear from Brigadier Hamad how he perceives the impact of those issues in the future from a Gulf perspective. And finally, I think the ringing endorsement from Minister Dr. John Reid of UK commitment to Gulf security and readiness to support it with UK forces. Gentlemen, I think it's been a fascinating presentation. Thank you very much.